The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning around. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of election, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition. It is Friday, August 8th, 2014. Tonight's live edition of DTRH, I'm going to be getting into a different topic. I like to change gears up once in a while. You know I like to talk about politics, and I do analysis of what's going on, geopolitics, the news, and things like that, events. But from time to time, I like to shift gears a little bit and get into other things that pique my interest. And it also helps you understand sometimes some background information about things. In this case tonight, we're going to be talking about serial killers, and that'll help you at least understand somewhat the psychopathy of the very people that become politicians. Most of them have the same type of thinking and the same lack of remorse for human beings. Anyway, since I'm normally talking about politics and all that, tonight I want to focus on another interesting topic, and that would be serial killers. Now, in order to do this topic justice, I'm going to have to do multiple broadcasts on this, and I plan on it. But to start off with, to pique your interest in this is something I've been researching since I was a teenager. I wanted to bring on an author that I heard recently on, it was an archived interview he did, if I remember correctly, it's from back in May, on Coast to Coast. And I had stumbled across it looking for some serial killer documentaries and stuff one night on YouTube just to see if there was anything out there that I haven't seen yet, or maybe some more information for me to gobble up about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I stumbled across this interview. And I was just blown away by the information by the end of the broadcast. And I know that there are a lot of people that might say, well, I don't know, a lot of what he says, could be he's connecting a lot of murders and stuff to one individual. But there's, I got to tell you, this is not just somebody sitting in their basement connecting the dots and coming and saying, "Hey, Popeye, can I come on your show?" This is a retired detective, and he was a police detective, or sergeant of detectives, I should say, for a long time, and he retired back in 2005. I'm going to read you his bio in a second, but this isn't some dude sitting in his basement, in his mom's basement with a tinfoil hat on his head coming up when trying to connect the dots where there aren't dots. This is a seasoned veteran investigator, a professional, someone who did this for a living. He's brought people to justice. I mean, he's a cold case detective. He knows what he's talking about. You know, you can't, not that somebody in their basement couldn't connect the dots, but that's easily attacked by people saying, oh, they're not a professional, whereas here you have a professional connecting the dots. And some of the stuff that, you know, he presents, it can be, I guess, a little frustrating to those that might think they have the answer already. But as I've said to everybody, don't let your emotions connect you to a preconceived notion. Okay? Allow, if new facts come to light, allow the evidence to speak for itself. So that being said, I'm going to allow the evidence to speak for itself. We're going to talk about one of the most prolific serial killers. If what my guest tonight, John A. Cameron, has discovered is true, and I don't have any reason to not believe his work, of course I have questions, but if what he has discovered here and presented is true, and the police departments across the nation can act upon this and get into it further and do these investigations and see if they can connect it through the proper legal channels or whatever, and get it on record that, yes, he's connected to these murders, this man will be known as, I would say, one of the most prolific, if not the most prolific serial killer. He had been killing since he was 11 years old, and they didn't catch him until he was in his 70s. That's amazing. Usually they catch the killers long before that. The fact that this guy was out there for so long doing this just makes you wonder exactly how many people he actually did kill. But anyway, I don't want to waste any more time. Let me read you a little bit about my guest tonight, and then I want to bring him up because I don't want to waste any more time. I want to get right into this because this is going to, I know the 2 hours is going to fly right by. I spent the past week going over his book, and you have to get it, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, you definitely have to get his book. You can go to coldcasecameron.com. Coldcasecameron.com is his website, and the book title is It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the Serial Killer You Never Heard Of. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. If you're into this, you really won't be disappointed. Anyway, my guest tonight is John A. Cameron. He's a 53-year-old retired police detective from Great Falls, Montana. His career in law enforcement began in 1979. He retired in 2005 as a sergeant of detectives, working cold cases. He has worked on FBI serial killer task forces, been featured on America's Most Wanted, Dateline NBC, and he helped produce a series known as Most Evil on TruTV back in 2010. In 2010, while working as an analyst for the Montana Board of Pardons and Parole in Deer Lodge Prison, Montana, he was in a position to access information that had been kept secret for 55 years, unraveling the most intelligent serial killer ever. I promise you, after tonight's broadcast, ladies and gentlemen, you are going to be interested enough to get his book. I urge you to purchase the book. Get it. Do the research. Once you read the book, cover to cover, don't just come up with assumptions or just read the book and then go to his website. And the website itself is an addendum to the book. And we're going to get into that and more. Anyway, let's get to my guest. Welcome to the broadcast, John. Thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Thank you, Popeye, for having me on. This is an important story to tell to the whole nation, so I'm glad you contacted me to ask me to be on. I appreciate it.
Well, I respect. I was a private investigator. I was never a law enforcement officer myself. I was in the Coast Guard. I did federal law enforcement, and I was a private investigator for a couple of years. And I did investigations and stuff, but nothing to this magnitude. But between being an investigator myself of sorts and doing investigative journalism and then having this interest in serial killers, when I came across your interview that you did on Coast to Coast, I was just blown away because, I mean, like I said to you, I went back and listened to the interview 4 or 5 times before I called you because my jaw was on the floor because you were able to connect this guy, Edward Wayne Edwards, that I've never even heard of, to a lot of these different murders, some of them very famous. And, it blew my mind because here, I could say, again, well, if I wanted to be a skeptic, well, this guy, he's just an author, maybe he's just trying to sell a book. But here you are, a seasoned cold case detective. You've worked on task forces going after serial killers. So this is not, not that someone, independently couldn't do it, an author, but it just goes to show you that disparaging thinking has to go away. I mean, here you are, a seasoned professional, and the information you're bringing it's like dropping atomic bombs of information. So I'm going to shut up. I'm going to give you the floor. I'll start with this. What got you interested in Edward Wayne Edwards, considering, like you said, the serial killer you've never heard of?
Sure, let me tell you a little bit about me and how I became to get involved with him. I'm a retired police detective from Great Falls, Montana. I did 24 years here and specialized in cold cases. And when I retired, I went to work in Deer Lodge Prison, Montana for the Parole Board. And my job was to interview inmates that were asking for parole and analyze them, dig up their records, interview them, and then make a recommendation as to whether they were worthy of a parole. But in this position in June of 2010, I was notified about a serial killer back in Ohio named Edward Wayne Edwards, and he was 77 years old in June of 2010 when I first heard of him. He had just been caught for his first murder and was confessing to 5 murders in June of 2010 in Ohio and Wisconsin, and those 5 murders spanned a 20-year period of time. And so a memo went out to any communities in the United States that might have unsolved double murders, particularly back in the 50s and 60s, because Edwards had apparently ran the country back in the 50s and 60s as an escaped criminal and committed a rash of robberies. But now in 2010, when he's being identified as a serial killer, they wanted everybody to look back and see if they could put him in their towns during any killings. And being a retired cold case detective, I had an unsolved double murder that happened on New Year's of 1956. And in that case, a young woman and man were parked on the banks of the Sun River in a car and were approached by someone dressed like a police officer with a flashlight. And he ordered them out of the car, and he forced the girl to tie the boy up with a belt. Then he put the boy on his knees and executed him in the head. And he kidnapped the girl, and then he terrorized her for several hours and then took her to the top of the highest point in town and put her on her knees and executed her and got away with murder. In 1956, the case never got solved. But in June of 2010, when the memo came out, I was able to tie Edwards to Great Falls at the time of the murder because I worked in Deer Lodge Prison and had access to his criminal records, and prove that he had actually been here and fled right after the murder and got away with it. So that's how I first got introduced to Edward Edwards. He was confessing to 5 murders. I had an unsolved murder. I connected him to it and decided to confront him with a letter to see if he'd confess.
So we know for a fact on the books right now that he's got 5 murders on him, correct?
Yep, 5 murders spanning 20 years.
Okay, and that's what he's legally on the on the books with the legal system got charged for. But how many would you say? And we're going to dive deep into this. But how many would you say, in your estimation, from the time you started investigating this till now, do you think he killed in reality?
Well, when you look back at how he worked in 2009, when he finally got caught, in 2010, when he finally confessed to the 5 murders, 4 of those murders were very similar to the 1956 Great Falls murder. That is, they were couples who were kidnapped, stabbed, tortured, shot, just horrible. And they were kind of like Lover's Lane's killings from 1977 and 1980. So he confessed to those to get his death penalty in 2010, and they matched the murder that I had in 56. So I knew that he'd been killing from 1956 until 2010 when he's finally confessing. And so I went back, actually, to the very beginning of his life and spent the last 4 years documenting the entire investigation, interviewing his wives, children. And the number of people he killed will be in the hundreds, if not over 1,000.
Wow. Just... wow. The fact that this guy was killing from the time he was 11 years old And actually, isn't there? I think his mother was killed, right? His mother was shot in the stomach. Was that done by him, or was that done just in his presence?
That's a very important part about what happened to him. He was born in 1933. That's the height of the Great Depression. And he was born in Ohio, near the Cleveland area. And he was raised by an aunt and uncle until the age of 5. And that aunt and uncle always told him that they were his parents. But what actually was true was that he was conceived in the backseat of a car. He never knew his father. He never knew his mother. And when he was 5 years old, this woman comes out of prison, and he's introduced to his mother for the first time. The aunt and uncle abandon him, give him to the mother, the height of the Great Depression. It's 1938 now. He's 5 years old. She dies of a suspicious gunshot wound to her stomach in August of 1938 and lives a period of 6 days in the house and then finally dies. And his name is changed right after the shooting. He was originally born Charles Edward Myers, and after the shooting of his mother, he's placed in a Catholic orphanage. His name is changed to Edward Wayne Edwards. He's beat, raped, beat by the nuns, molested by the older boys, and by age 11 escapes Parmedale Catholic Orphanage and starts committing what he would call the rest of his life crimes of recognition. And what he meant by that were murders that would shock the conscience and be so horrific that they would live in infamy and everybody would talk about him for the rest of their lives. And that's what he started doing at age 11.
And the fact that he was able to do this until he was in his 70s is incredible. And we're gonna cover the span here. So let's start off with his first couple of murders when he was 11 years old. I mean, to think that an 11-year-old could kill, for me, it doesn't go beyond the pale, because I understand. I doing researching this stuff since I was a teenager, well over 20 years now. I've come to an understanding that kids can be just as evil as adults. I mean, I have a book called Lustmord. If you've never read it, get it. I suggest go ahead and grab a copy. It's cheap on Amazon. It's called Lustmord: The Writings and Artifacts of Murderers. And it's their journals, the things they wrote when they were in prison, some of their confessions, whatever. And some of the stuff, I mean, some of these people that were involved were little kids. I think one little girl was like 9 or 10 years old, and she would lure little boys out into the woods and then kill them with like a rock to the head and then mutilate them by cutting off their penises. And she was like, again, 9 or 10 years old. So the fact that he started at the age of 11 to some people might be shocking, but it's actually, as strange as this sounds, it happens more often than you would think. I'll put it that way. So go ahead, John. He starts off with his first kill at the age of 11.
Yeah, by the age of 11, it's 1945, and he escapes the orphanage, and he goes to Chicago, where he breaks into the homes of 2 women sleeping, one in June and one in December of 1945, beats them in the face, stabs them, shoots them, and then writes messages on the wall, very childish messages stating, "Please stop me, I can't control myself." And then his next victim is a little 6-year-old girl in January of 1946 named Suzanne Dignan, who is sleeping in her house while her parents are there. He lures her out of the house, takes her to a nearby basement where he dismembers her, beheads her, and then spreads her remains around the streets of Chicago in 1946, taunting the police with anonymous letters, phone calls, and very immature-ish writings, challenging them to catch him. And it's clearly all written by a very immature-ish person writing it. Well, it turns out that the little girl that was killed in 1946, her father was in charge of the funding of the Parmedale Catholic Orphanage that Edwards had escaped. And he targeted him specifically for that reason, for his horrible abuse he lived through in Cleveland Parmedale Catholic Orphanage. And that case was known as the Lipstick Killings. And a man named William Herons was arrested eventually in June of 1946 for that killing and confessed. and then recanted immediately, but then spent 66 years in prison, called the Lipstick Killer. And that was Edwards' first setup, and that would be his MO the rest of his life, would be to kill somebody, create a horrific murder, taunt the police with false letters, phone calls, false evidence, and set up an innocent person, lead the evidence to them, and then watch the system kill for him. And so he just started that in 1945-46, and he did it every year, every decade, up until his capture in 2009.
And to think that an 11-year-old child is smart enough to and mature enough to actually do this. And again, people say, I just don't buy it. But I'm telling you, if you actually do the research on serial killers, you will see that these evil kids usually end up having a very high IQ, and they end up maturing. And I don't want to say they're fully matured, but they end up maturing to a certain extent much faster than other children their age, and they're able to have these thoughts. I mean, it doesn't mean I agree and that it's a great thing and we should all high five and be kumbaya about it, but it's the reality of the situation. It sounds scary, but it's just, unless you research this or you watch true crime and stuff like that, or investigate Discovery or any of those type of networks or anything, you're not going to really know this stuff. But it doesn't surprise me that a child of 11 years old was able to do that. Now, a question about his MO, because you mentioned that his MO was to frame other people. It's interesting that, unlike other killers, a lot of times serial killers have a certain MO that they do, how they do the kills themselves. It's almost like a certain ritual that they have to go through time after time. Once in a while, it'll metamorphosis and perhaps grow in an upward direction. It'll never devolve. It'll always evolve into whatever more evil, sadistic thing. But it's interesting how his MO wasn't so much with the killing itself, but creating these horrific murders and then more so getting other people to take the fall for it. That's interesting because that's more guile than some of these other killers that are more so monsters. Not that this guy wasn't a monster, but there's this sick, twisted intelligence there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what he had. And he was so different from most serial killers because most of them have some type of a sexual addiction, a violence addiction, something that gets them caught eventually. Edwards didn't have that. His addiction was the kill itself and the recognition. And what I keep repeating that word recognition is because he repeated it throughout his life in every interview he gave, and he gave thousands of them to the media over the years, that he was into crime for recognition. And what that meant was to commit a horrific murder and be able to wake up on any given day and open up the paper, and there's your murder on the pages, but the cops and nobody knows who they're looking for, but they're pinning it on an innocent guy, and you get to sit back and watch that. And then when those jurisdictions would convict innocent people, he would return and kill again and see if they'd do it again. And many places did it again and again and again. And some of the states where he did his most prolific killing were Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Texas. And that's because those states put people to death more than anyone else. And he knew that. And he used that his whole life to see if he could get officials to go after innocent people. And he did it everywhere.
To me, that type of thinking, that level of intelligence, like the way, like that MO is actually, I guess it's actually a bit more scarier, I don't know if that's the right word, than some of these guys that are just monsters, because not only was this guy a monster, but he was a highly intelligent monster. Like he obviously had a decently high IQ. Was he ever IQ tested? Do you know if he had? I think I've heard you mention that he was IQ tested. Something the high 130s, I think, right?
Yeah, in 1945, actually, he was giving a series of tests just before he was released from the orphanage to go home for Christmas, and they showed that he had an IQ of 132. That he was diagnosed a sadomasochist already, that he had a deep dislike for older people, and he was very conflicted over his mother who was his mother, who was his father, and he had an identity crisis. And so his whole life, he used his intelligence to outsmart people. And in many of the cases where he wrote letters, many serial killers will write their journals and they'll keep them secret. But Edwards would actually write his journals and publish them. And I think your listeners need to know that this man, when he was 36 years old, published a book, a 460-page book autobiography on his life, claiming that he was a reformed criminal in 1972, that he used to be a bad guy, and now he's a happily married family man with 5 kids. But this book ended up being an entire puzzle of murder by a serial killer. And if you don't mind, I should read the cover for your listeners.
No, actually, go ahead. We got about 30 seconds till we go to break, but go ahead.
Okay, the book is titled Metamorphosis of a Criminal, and it states, he was on the FBI's list of the 10 most wanted criminals. He was a hold-up man, a bank robber, a dangerous character, and he spent 14 years in 5 jails. Now he is a writer, a respected citizen, and the head of a family of 5. Metamorphosis of a Criminal, the true Ed Edwards story. And this book ended up being a puzzle of murder by a serial killer of 23 years of murder back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Talk about the gall on this guy. He actually wrote a book about himself. And as John was telling me off air, that was actually a key to helping him as a detective. Again, he's a seasoned cold case detective, ladies and gentlemen. All those shows you see on TV, we're actually talking to a real cold case detective here, okay? And he was able to use this guy's book to connect him to multiple murders. Stay tuned, break sneaking up, 3 short minutes, don't go anywhere. ColdCaseCameron.com is the website, go get the book. You won't be disappointed, stay tuned. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. So, when John and I got interrupted, we were getting into Edwards' own book. This guy was, talk about the ego in this guy. He actually wrote a book about himself, about, I'm a reformed criminal, all the while he's not a reformed criminal. And, it's just, there's so much information in this book, a 2-hour broadcast isn't going to do it justice. It's really not. A 3 or 4 hour broadcast wouldn't do it justice. What you need to do, and look, if you're into this, if you're into researching serial killers and true crime and stuff, I promise you the book's worth it. Go to coldcasecameron.com. Go pick up the book. The title is It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the serial killer you never heard of. You can also pick it up on Amazon. They're hardcover editions right now. I'm sure the Kindle ones are coming, and I'll let John answer that in a second. But you can get the hardcover right now. Grab a copy of it, read the book, and then use the website, coldcasecameron.com, as the addendum to it. I think it's interesting that, even though John will say that he's, a cop, not so much an author. The author thing came second, right? The fact that he put up an addendum to go with it, I find that interesting. Not many authors do that. So I find it unique, at least from a researcher's aspect, that not only do you have the book, but then there's this website itself that you can go to and use as an addendum, and there's more pictures and stuff available and other things up there. So anyway, getting back, I want to pick John's brain. So, John, you were saying that this book that Edwards wrote, and I'll let you throw the name out there again because I totally forgot it, but this book was a key to you being able to connect him to, being in the same places as a lot of these other murders that happened going back throughout time. So what was the title of the book again? And then I guess my first question about the book is, when you read the book, did your jaw hit the floor? I mean, were you astonished that you were actually able to sit there and go bam, 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 like one after the other? And he actually himself, it wasn't like you're coming up with this. He himself puts himself in these very cities and areas at the time of a lot of these murders, correct?
Yeah, that's right. It was actually the book that the Homeland Security Department used to issue the memo out to the cities for unsolved homicides in 2010, because Edwards actually detailed his documentation of his life of travels from the time he was born until the time he was 68, or 1968, when he came out of Leavenworth Prison, claiming to be a reformed criminal. And that's when he wrote this book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, it's called, The True Life Story of Ed Edwards. And what it should have been called is Metamorphosis of a Killer, because that's what it ended up being. As soon as I saw that he wrote the book and they were looking at him for a double murder possibly in my area, I bought the book, and I couldn't believe what I read in there. He placed himself in Great Falls in 1956 at the time of our double murder. And here he was confessing 40 years later after writing the book to the same types of murders. And that in itself was a jaw dropper. But after reading the book, I couldn't believe how it unraveled the puzzle. If you had taken his NCIC criminal records, which I had access to, and the book, and just followed his life of arrest up until 1968, and follow his life in his book, it revealed the murders he had done in cities all over, every part of the United States, 1945 until 1968. And he came to my hometown, married a gal, kidnapped her, and took her all over the United States in 1955 and 56, creating these horrific ritual murders all over, and forcing her to drive the car as he would change into his uniform, or portray himself as a preacher, or portray himself as a doctor of psychiatry. Those were his three ruses. He would be a married family man, doctor of psychiatry, preacher, and a police officer. And he had all the credentials to prove that he was someone other than he was, and that he was those positions. So he got his victims to come to him.
That's just insane that this guy was, I mean, this is in the 50s, and he was at that level where he had costumes, IDs. I mean, this is stuff that you would think would only be, going on today with the technology and the level of thinking that we have today. And yet here you have, back in the 50s, this was going on. I mean, again, that's why I say, I think, and I said this to you off air, if he was tested when he was a kid and his IQ was 132 as a child, I'm willing to bet that by the time he was in his 70s, his IQ, if they had tested him, probably, okay, maybe if he was getting older and he maybe start losing brain cells, let's say we'll test him in his 40s, right? Like midlife, 45. I'm willing to bet that he probably would have had an IQ somewhere around mid 140s, easily 150, because this is a higher level of thinking the way he was operating. I mean, just his MO alone blows me away. That, as I said, most serial killers, like you said, they a lot of times they do it for the sexual thrill, and they have a specific routine that they do over and over and over again. And this guy was just different. I mean, he just did it, he did it for the murder, but also for the notoriety, which we can get into the notoriety thing in hour two. I have a couple questions about that. So he's running around with this woman in the 50s. Did he eventually kill this woman? I don't think he would have let her go, because then obviously she would have ratted him out, and he would have been in jail, right? So I'm assuming he killed her.
No, actually what happened is in October of 1955, he met his wife that he came to Great Falls with in 56, and her name was Jeanette, and she was from Idaho Falls, and she was just 18 years old, pretty naive. He kidnapped her, basically. He raped her. He got her pregnant and forced her to drive around the country while he committed these murders. And then he ended up in my hometown, where he committed a robbery and fled and got caught 200 miles away. And she was with him. And they were both under assumed name. He was Dr. James Garfield Langley, and she was the wife who was pregnant at the time. So that was the ruse. They were in a stolen car. He got arrested and went to Deer Lodge Prison. But during the interview of his arrest, he did not allow the police officers to talk to his wife back in the 50s, because back then you could do that. There was no such thing as Miranda warning. There was no such thing as the court system we have now. And a wife can't testify against the husband. So he knew that. So that's why he always was married when he was killing. And his woman was the ruse. And he ended up in Deer Lodge Prison. She ended up having a baby here in Great Falls in August of 1956, and then divorced him, and never got questioned at all about their exploits until 2011, when I arrived in Idaho Falls and found her down there. And it was a pretty devastating interview for her, because she had never told her son, who was born here, who the father was, and she had actually been forced to partake in some of the crimes.
Wow. So when you reached out to her, was that actual first time that she had ever opened her mouth and told anybody and spoken aloud what she had witnessed and partaken in with him all those years ago?
Yes, the only other time that she had ever spoken to law enforcement about him was in 1959. He was released by the Montana Board of Pardons and Parole, and that's who I worked for in 2010. He was released on parole to Oregon, and he had gone out to Oregon, and he killed a couple there in 1960, and then escaped the Portland County Jail and became America's Most Wanted in 1961. And the police came to her to warn her that he was on the run. But they never questioned her. And it turns out there was a reason why the FBI never questioned him, is that's because Edwards was an informant from 1950 all the way up until his capture for law enforcement all over the place. He would inform on his own murders under assumed identities and lead the evidence to innocent people. And it worked over and over again.
Wow. Again, this goes to show you a level of intelligence yes, again, the monster itself is scary, but I think what's also scary is the level of intelligence and the way this guy operated. Obviously, he was on a complete different wavelength than the rest of the human beings around him. Just incredible. And through his book, you were able to connect him to a lot of things, and through your research into him, since you learned about him and started researching him, you were able to connect him to some pretty high-profile cases. Now, you say that you're able to connect him to things like the Black Dahlia murders, the Zodiac murders, and the JonBenét Ramsey murder. So let's start off with Black Dahlia, since she's the oldest of all of this. He would have had to have been around 14, right, at the time of her murder?
Yeah, he was 13 and a half years old.
And you're able to connect him to her murder. Explain for the listeners, in as much detail as you want. And again, ladies and gentlemen, John and I couldn't do this topic justice. And you don't have to believe, everything that either one of us says or what John talks about or anything. I always urge you to do your own research. But I do urge you, if you're going to do the research, then at least get the reference material, which would be his book, and then use his website, coldcasecameron.com, as a reference, because I know you have more pictures and stuff up there, too, that go along with the book. So I urge all the listeners, if you do purchase the book, use the website as an addendum to it while you're researching this. So, again, Black Dahlia, if he's 13 and a half years old when she's murdered, how did he do that? How is he connected to her murder?
Well, let me start with how it got to there, because the Black Dahlia murder never came into the investigation until 2 years into it. And for your listeners that don't know who she is, that was Elizabeth Short, and she was cut in two on January 15th, 1947, and laid out in a public lot down in Los Angeles. She was a beautiful 22-year-old gal, inspired actress, and somebody cut her in two pieces and laid her out in a public parking lot in 1947. Never was solved. It was kind of one of the biggest cases ever over the decades. But after I found Edwards had written this book, connected him to the double murder here in Great Falls, I took the book and I tore it apart and I turned it into a PDF file so that the phrasing in the book could be searched on the internet. Because the important thing about Edwards was he was an author. He was a publisher. He appeared in movies. He wrote his own album. And he also authored his own websites as he got older in life. And his book was a puzzle, but so was every movie appearance, radio appearance, or anything he appeared on. And he appeared in thousands of places. You can see quite a few of them on my website, coldcasecameron.com, if you go to the timeline and just look at what he did to his life. But it was the book, Metamorphosis of a Criminal, that led me to the Black Dahlia case, and to a website that eventually Edwards published in 2002, and that website was called blackdahliasolution.org, and it really ended up being the Black Dahlia Solution, and it was authored by Ed Edwards. And the beginning of how I tied him to that through the phrasing in the book was he placed himself in Los Angeles at the time of the killing and 13 years old. And I'll read a little portion of what he said. One of the things on Edwards' website is the frequently asked questions. And somebody asked him, I am wondering what drew the author to the case, referring to the Black Dahlia case. And he answered, in January of 1947, I was 13 years old. I loved riddles and murder mysteries. I regularly listened to radio programs like Suspense, The Whistler, Lights Out, and Inner Sanctum, and I was impressionable. On January 16th, 1947, I read Fiend Tortures, Kills Girl, Leaves Body in L.A. Lot in the Morning L.A. Examiner. The front page article said that the girl was nude and bisected at the waist. This reading goes on for quite a ways, but what that was Edwards placing himself in Los Angeles at the age of 13 at the time that Black Dahlia was killed. And then he further connected himself to the killing of 6-year-old Suzanne Dignan a year earlier and tied both the Black Dahlia, 1947, and the killing of 6-year-old Suzanne Dignan, 1946, to him. And he published it on a website as a puzzle, just like his book. And he killed JonBenét Ramsey 50 years after he killed little Suzanne Dignan in 1946. And both girls were 2 little 6-year-old girls sleeping in their house at night while their parents slept, taken to the basement. JonBenét was threatened to be beheaded, and she practically was. And Suzanne Dignan was beheaded. And those 2 cases were tied together. They were 50 years apart. Edwards is both murders, 1946, 1996.
And then there's the Zodiac murders and the West Memphis Three murders, which I remember the HBO documentary. I was telling you this off air. I remember the HBO documentary Paradise Lost about those murders. I think it aired in '94, if I remember correctly. And I remember seeing it when I was like 17 or 18 years old at the time. And this was a couple of years after I had started researching serial killers. And you brought up that Edwards is actually in the video. There's a shot of him holding the dollar bill and showing the back of the dollar bill where it says "Annuit Coeptis Novus Ordo Secularum," and it's got the all-seeing eye, and and of course he was into the occult, which we're going to get into too. And I have a couple questions about that because I have a few questions, about what you think he might have been connected to and with that as well. But that in itself I found completely mind-blowing. And I remember seeing the documentary, and then you show a picture of him in the video. And you actually went back and contacted the producers, I think it was, of the video, the people that had made it, and they can't account for how this guy got into the video shot. Like, I think it was while the parents were talking, he comes up in the video shot. I'll let you elaborate on it. It's just, that to me is like going back to the crime scene, injecting yourself back into it. Now that is the MO of what these serial killers do a lot of times, in one way or another. And a lot of times you see other criminals do it as well. So anyway, I'll let you elaborate on that. I just thought it was very interesting that he showed up in the Paradise Lost documentary that HBO put out about the very killings that he did.
Yeah, let me kind of explain what the West Memphis case is. A lot of people know that and some don't, but that happened in May of 1993 on a full moon night, May 5th, 1993, Cinco de Mayo Day. 3 little 8-year-old boys were brought to Robin Hood Hills Park, where they were stripped naked, beat severely, tied up in a very ritualistic pattern. Funny star-shaped patterns were stamped on their bodies. One of the boys' penises was removed. And in the end, 3 teens ended up going down for the crime. 3 kids in West Memphis, Arkansas, that dressed in black, basically, were said to be Satanists and that they must have done it. And so they got convicted. And HBO followed this whole trial back in 1993, 94, 95, when it was going on. And they did a documentary. And there was a scene in the document called Christmas. And it's filmed on December 19th. 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas. And the scene is the parents of one of the victims, the Byers victim, the Byers boy. And they're sitting at the grave of their son crying that Christmas is never going to be the same without their son. And suddenly, the cameraman chose to take a 10-second shot of an old man standing behind them. He's wearing a hat, a fake beard, and carrying a cane, and holding a $1 bill right into the camera, showing Osiris's eye in the Egyptian pyramid, and then puts the money in his wallet, and the shot ends. Well, the man in the picture ended up being Edward Edwards, and the cane he was holding was actually the weapon that was used to beat the boys to death. You know, as the Zodiac Killer was always saying he was waiting for a good movie of him. But Edwards had had movies of his murders playing for decades, and his ultimate goal was to get himself injected into his own murder movie, and he did it at Paradise Lost. And that film actually debuted June of 1996, and it would be 6 months later that he will kill JonBenét Ramsey after that debuted, 666. He played games with numbers, and he was a Satanist. And he did these types of ritualistic murders all over. And the West Memphis Three case was actually another replication of a murder he had done just before he came to my hometown in 1956. He had done the same type of murder, 3 little teens in a park in Chicago, only that park was Robinson Woods Park, and removed flesh from one of the boys, laid him out in the sign of the cross, and carved a Big Dipper in the leg of one of them. So 13 years before he actually did the Zodiac killings in 1968, Ed Edwards kidnaps 3 little boys, strips them naked, ties them up, lays them out in the park in the sign of the cross, and carves the Big Dipper in their leg. That's the type of stuff this man did, and that's what the Zodiac was. The Zodiac was Satan, and he was playing out ritualistic, ancient Egyptian gods, and forcing his victims to play out some of the rituals.
And I remember that you mentioned that he had, or JonBenét, I think it was a family friend, she had said something about she was going to get a personal visit from Santa Claus on Christmas Day, and the family friend had corrected her and said, no, it's Christmas Eve. And she said, no, my Santa comes on Christmas Day. If you look at the picture of Edwards in that documentary that HBO did, if you look at his face when he's holding that dollar bill and stuff, and he's doing the twiddly, thumbs thing, if you look, he's got a beard, a white beard. And I just thought about that while we were talking about the JonBenét case. I was thinking, and I was like, I remember he had said that she had mentioned something about a family friend saying that she gets a personal visit from her Santa Claus, and then here you have, you're saying that 6 months after the documentary aired is when she was killed, and in the documentary you see he's got this big white beard and he's kind of fat at the time, and he could pass for quote unquote Santa Claus.
Yeah, that's exactly what he was doing there. There's St. Nick, and he's actually wearing the same kind of hat that you see in the picture of Hannibal on a lot of the productions, that straw hat. He was horrible. He had gotten himself into that camera shot, and what's even worse is after the shot ends and you watch the parents lying by the grave, you'll see that the production crew actually takes the star-shaped pattern, shadow, and will place it direct center of the father's forehead. And the day that was filmed, the whole intent of Edwards was to try to get that father set up for the murder of his child. And a knife was injected into the scene that day that ended up becoming a very controversial piece during the trial as to how this knife came in, whose knife was it, who brought it in, and the killer was actually right in front of them. But nobody thought that nice little old man sitting at the grave looking like Santa Claus was the killer.
So he actually was able to taint the crime scene while they were filming the documentary and almost get the father to be blamed for the murder.
Well, to this day, you hear the most vile comments about poor Mr. Byers. I mean, here he had his 8-year-old son kidnapped, tortured, and killed, and the evidence was now being steered to make it look like he did it, which is exactly what happened in JonBenét Ramsey. That's how Edwards worked. He would always groom his victims months, if not years, sometimes decades, before he killed someone close to him. Get into their family, make it look like an inside job, steer the evidence to a parent, and then watch the public and the press and the jury system destroy that innocent person. And he did it over and over, and I guess the best example was John and Patsy Ramsey.
And I think it's interesting, and we're going to get into this in the second hour, but when you look into a lot of these murders, even if you don't look into Edwards, okay, say people don't want to believe that Edwards was involved, okay, fine. But when you look into a lot of these murders, the occult always comes up. And of course, the occult just means, the word actually means hidden. But the dark occult, I should say, comes up. And hardcore Satanism seems to pop up. And I think it's interesting because this guy, Edwards, was, for lack of a better term, a student of Aleister Crowley. As most of you, my faithful listeners, know, is referred to as one of the wickedest men in the world, they call him. And he truly was an evil person, do what thou willst. And that's the attitude that the powers that shouldn't be put out. And we all know that anyway. That's a side issue. But you can see how this guy was a student of the very same individual that, as I said in the beginning, politicians are psychopaths too, and a lot of them are behind the scenes. And I know some people might find this hard to believe, but they are involved in some of this very high level Satanism. So I find it interesting that this guy was a student of Crowley's. And we got about 2 minutes before we go to break, but I'll throw this out, and we could chat about this, and we can get into it in the second hour. But do you think that being a hardcore Satanist and being whatever level he was at, whatever he did, obviously he was killing people perhaps at a certain level that was helping along with his beliefs, but do you think he was part of a much larger cult, and that's how he could have had some help? I mean, it is. I know it's a possibility that cults do work together in tandem behind the scenes. There are some really bad ones that it's not a bunch of teenagers, worshiping the devil or doing quote unquote witchcraft in the woods. At night, it's actually really there are cults that do involve people that are doctors, lawyers, and on the street they look like normal everyday average Joe. So I just wonder if you think really quick if he was part of that at all. Do you think he was connected to anything like that?
Well, he was the top dog, that's for sure. But yeah, he had people below him, and I actually interviewed one of those people in Deer Lodge Prison, Frank Dryman, who Edwards had actually been in prison with in 1956 through 59 in Deer Lodge. And those two were both occultists and were playing it out in Deer Lodge Prison back then. But Edwards, as for did he have help in his murders, if anybody helped him in his murders and were a witness, they were dead.
He probably killed him.
I
would assume he probably killed him afterwards. I'm going to cut us off because the break is sneaking up, but we can get back into this question on the other side because this is one of the things I wanted to ask you. So, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Again, go check out John's book, coldcasecameron.com. Get the book. Bookmark the website. It's an addendum to the book. Look up Edward Wayne Edwards. Interesting to say the least. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, from federaljack.com. As always, I urge you to go check out the archives over on Federal Jack. All the show archives are over there. I'm a few shows behind because I've been busy the past few weeks, but I will get everything up to date in the next week or so. Just go over to the download section. You can download anything you want for free, all of the shows, and anything I've done on Truth Frequency is also available over on Truth Frequency. But you can get all the older broadcasts going back to when I first did my first radio show and any special podcasts and stuff I did over at Federal Jack. So go check it out. Anyway, I want to get back into what we were talking about because this is an extremely interesting topic, and 2 hours is not enough time. I don't even think 4 or 5 hours is enough time to talk about this. Go to John's website, coldcasecameron.com, coldcasecameron.com. If you're interested in true crime, if you research about serial killers, get his book. It's titled, It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, The Serial Killer You Never Heard Of. It's available on his website and on Amazon.com, and I know John will be releasing a Kindle version soon, but that it takes time to do all that stuff, and I'm sure he's a busy man. So go check out the book itself. And I always tell you, look, I have a Kindle e-reader. I love it. My wife got me one for Christmas. I think it's great. I use it for when I have to travel and stuff. But I still have physical copies of every book that I have on that thing. I have a physical copy of it get a physical copy of this book. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. So, when we went to break, John, we were talking about Edwards' connection to the dark occult. And I had to ask you, your take really quick because the bumper music was coming up and cutting us off there. The break was sneaking up on us. But I had asked you, for the listeners that are just joining here in an hour or two, I'd asked John if Edwards is the serial killer, if his connection with the dark occult, if he was connected to any cults themselves. It's not a new concept. That this actually is something that at least I've stumbled across. I've seen that there are more of these types of individuals connected to these cults themselves than you would think. So that show on Fox that they have, The Following, where it's a cult of serial killers, doesn't that kind of, to a certain extent, does ring true, except they kind of portray them to be lost individuals. And a lot of these people that participate in these ceremonies or these satanic cults are lawyers, doctors, judges, police officers, sports players, whatever. A lot of people of quote unquote high stature, and some people in positions of authority, politicians. And time after time, when I see connections to the dark occult in a serial killing case, I always wonder if they're connected to a much larger cult. Not that the murders were, but if the covering up of the murders, so to speak, was done not just by one individual, but there's certain things that would have to have other individuals involved. And who better to have involved but your fellow cult members? So when we were getting into the break, I had asked John about that, but I'll let him reiterate because we got cut off. So John, I know we were talking about it during the break, you and I, but thoughts on that?
Well, I'll give you an example kind of how Edwards and the occult worked. In 1979, 1980, and 81, he killed all of these little children in Atlanta. He's the real Atlanta child killer. And what he would do in that case is he would portray himself as a police officer. He actually had the uniform. He had a relative that lived in Atlanta at the time and was a police sergeant on a police department down there. I've actually got a photograph of him with the captain of the Atlanta Police Department. But what he would do is kidnap, let's say, 2 children, and he would hold them. He actually, in the Atlanta child case, gave them to some sexual predators, and then killed the kids, and then killed the sexual predators. And that's how he would work. He would never allow anybody to have one up on him and know about any killing. There were lots of low-level people below him involved in the occult, but he was the top dog, and he was connected to Charlie Manson. He was in Leavenworth prison with Charlie Manson, and there's plenty of evidence of that, and I've got a letter sitting here right in front of me where he admits it. He was competing with people like Charlie Manson. He would never let anybody be a better killer than him. So what I mean by that is when any serial killer was in the newspapers over the decades of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and they were getting recognition, their murders were in the paper or they were caught, Edwards would make sure to go to wherever that serial killer was caught and create a murder of recognition that would outdo that person and take it out of the press. And his murders would always be in the press. He was, as a cult, though, he wasn't a guy that would walk into some building where they're having a cult meeting. He was the top dog killer, and it was his job, as he told me in an interview, to know every one of these people. And if you go on my website on July 9th, 1993, on the timeline, you can read the letter I'm referring to, and it'll give you a great insight to Ed Edwards. It's actually a 3-page letter he sent the FBI in 1993 after killing the little boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. And that letter contained everything needed to figure out who he really was, that he really was the Zodiac Killer, and that he really was the killer of the 3 little boys in West Memphis. It was a puzzle, and that letter I got from his daughter in 2010, and that really showed me what his intelligence level was. He would stand right in front of the FBI, hand them everything to figure out who he was, and be able to walk away and they'd never suspect them.
Just incredible. I mean, like I said, I think the scarier thing, not just the fact that the guy was a monster, but the fact that the level of intelligence that this guy shows in the way he operated, not just kills, but the way he actually operated and did everything else. And I think that the idea that he's connected to some sort of, occult network or cult network, I should say, behind the scenes with other people to help him cover up his murders, I don't think that that's too, far out of the ordinary. I mean, that would actually explain how he was able to get away with a lot of the stuff. Not so much the killing itself, because I can understand if, somebody wants to get away with something like that, okay. But the massive amount of fraud that he committed while killing, because a lot of people say, well, what did Edwards do for a living? He killed. Like, he committed fraud with a lot of the murders that he did as well, and was able to benefit from that. Like, one of the killings he did was his own stepson, right? He adopted a guy, a kid, and then, I guess when he was of age, got him to go in the military, and then brought him back, or, helped the kid go AWOL or whatnot, and then killed him and collected an insurance policy on him, right?
Yeah, that case actually is the one that ended up getting him the death penalty. The case occurred in 1996, the same year JonBenét Ramsey was killed. Edwards actually lured a 22-year-old man. It was just a friend of his kids who wasn't very smart, actually. Asked him if he wanted a place to stay, invited him into his house, eventually convinced the kid to change his name to Edwards, Danny Boy Edwards, so that Edwards could be the beneficiary on a $250,000 insurance policy that he took out on him. And then he waited 2 years and then killed the guy behind a cemetery in Troy, Ohio, beheaded him, just like he did JonBenét, and then planted his body for a year, hiding it, waiting to collect, and then collected $250,000 in 1997 and used that money to just perpetuate more murder. He would fly all over the country in private jets. He was incredibly intelligent, always under assumed identity, and was most likely invited into first-class sections because he was so charming.
And you got to figure $250,000 in '97 was worth a lot more than it is now. So you got more with it back then, and you got to figure if he's done this once, again, he's probably part of this much larger network. I mean, it makes you wonder if he ever. A lot of times, these people that are connected to these cults, and I'll throw this out, and then we can move on. But a lot of times, the people that are connected to these things on the back end, like Jimmy Savile, right? It comes out now that guy out in the UK, that guy was a pedophile. But not only was he a pedophile, but he also helped procure children. I wonder if this guy helped procure kills, like maybe get people for them to use in sacrifices, and that's one of the reasons why they worked with him. And, he was maybe, I'm sure he probably took part in some of the ceremonies themselves, but it just, all these connections, I think that's what makes the fraud possible, because, I mean, you would figure if he was doing this since he was 11 years old, right? Eventually he would have gotten caught with covering things up or something. But if he's engaging, and even if he was just killing and not doing the fraud, but engaging in the fraud is another aspect where it opens himself up to, maybe they're not looking for a serial killer, maybe they're looking for a tax cheat or something or whatever, or insurance fraud, and he gets nailed that way. I think he was able to skate through all that because there had to be somebody helping him at least once in a while along the way. And I think that helps explain when people say to you, well, how the hell could he have done all this and gotten away with all this fraud? John, I think you're out of your mind. You're not thinking right on this one, buddy. And I have to say, no, understanding how cults and stuff work and understanding how there's actually more higher ranking people, like you said, there's a lot of lawyers in these things, and you're not kidding when you say that. You have high ranking people, politicians, judges, lawyers, whatever, prosecutors, police even. It doesn't surprise me that knowing that this would be able to be covered up, because perhaps he was important to them until he was no longer important. And then once they get to a certain age, they lose that protection, right? I mean, they same thing with Jimmy Savile. He's dead and buried, so they can throw him under the bus now. So knowing that how cults work, I think that actually helps booster your case somewhat, especially with the fraud and how he got away with it. And he admitted to you in interviews with you in conversations, whether it was through letters or you talking to him, that he did a lot of this, correct?
Yeah, Edwards made so many confessions over the years and published them and put them on our website and sent letters to police, for decades that contained actually confessions to murders if they had followed his life. But how Edwards would work with getting people to conspire with him was he would pick his victims very patiently and deliberately, and he knew that he would pick somebody and somehow rope that person into a financial gain for them, or they're going to get drugged, or they're going to get sex, or they're going to get some type of gain by the ruse he's using, and then he would get them to sin, get them to commit to the fraud that he's about to perpetuate. And they don't have any idea how it's all going to end is with the murder of somebody. And then the murder happens, and then all the people that have been part of the conspiracy are sitting in the back going, we're kind of attached to this and we can't say anything. So they don't say anything. And after Edwards was exposed in 2010, he actually contacted the media and went to the media in Wisconsin demanding to be interviewed. And the 2-hour interviews can be seen on YouTube. And they were really the Zodiac Killer standing in front of the world in 2010 trying to tell somebody to come on, look at me, look at who I am. And that's how he worked. A lot of people saw him and went, oh my God, it's him. He would always go to police departments whenever he moved and introduce himself to policemen and become their friends, so he'd have inside knowledge of all the cases going on in the city. And they didn't know that the real killer was actually part of them.
Just incredible. And I'm glad you brought up the Zodiac, because that was the next question. I know we covered in the first hour what you've been able to bring to light, the connections to Black Dahlia, and we've been talking about the JonBenét case. And again, ladies and gentlemen, you have to listen to the whole interview if you're just picking up, with us now. You have to get John's book, because a radio broadcast, is not enough time to do the research on this. You have to really know, not only about, I guess, some killers and how they work and MOs and stuff, and serial killers in general, but you also have to know about the occult. You have to read John's book and go to the website. You have to understand there's much more to this. It's like there's layers to it, and you have to peel away each layer, and each layer that you peel away, you learn more. So go get the book, coldcasecameron.com. And I say that because if you don't get the book, then, okay, yeah, it's a good broadcast. It might pique your interest. But if you're really interested in researching this and you want to challenge him and say, well, give me more evidence about Black Dahlia or JonBenét, well, I only have 2 hours to pick his brain about some of this stuff. So we highlight this stuff. But in his book, it goes into detail. So go over to coldcasecameron.com, get his book. It's me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the serial killer you never heard of. So the Zodiac murders, John. How did you first learn of his connection to the Zodiac murders? Again, I'm sure you used his book that he published to do this, but how did you first learn of his connection to the Zodiac murders?
Well, when he first got exposed in June of 2010, and then I connected him to a Lover's Lane murder here in Great Falls in 1956. Well, the Zodiac Killer was a killer of Lover's Lane couples. People parked on Lover's Lanes. They're lying on a beach. He would go up to them and stab them, shoot them, tie them up. And that's what happened in Great Falls in 1956. But another very important thing about the Zodiac Killer was that he attacked a couple on September 27th, 1969, on Lake Berryessa. And the woman's name was Celia Shepard, and the man's name was Brian Hartnell. And he actually left Brian alive to describe the whole thing as it played out. Although he stabbed Brian, he didn't kill him. He wanted him alive to explain what happened. And what happened in that case is Edwards walks in wearing the executioner's hood and the Zodiac cross and circle on his chest. And he starts conversing with the two on the beach, and he tells them that he had been in Deer Lodge Prison, that he had stolen a car, that he had killed a guard, and that he was headed to Mexico. And Edwards had actually been involved in the 1956 Deer Lodge Prison riot where the guard was killed. And everything he told Brian Hartnell at that beach was what Edwards had done, but he had done it in 1956. And so investigators spent a lot of time on the Zodiac case trying to figure out who might have been in Deer Lodge prison that might be the Zodiac Killer. Well, they just didn't go back far enough. And it was 13 years before the Zodiac started that Edwards was in Deer Lodge prison, had participated in the riot, the guard was killed, and he was trying to escape. And everything he told them at that thing matched. And then, inside of his book that he wrote in 1972, Edwards starts talking about a killer he knew that liked to collect slaves in his afterlife. And that was a direct quote out of one of the Zodiac ciphers that had been solved in 1969. And it ended up being that Edwards was the Zodiac Killer, and there's no doubt about it because my friend Neil, who worked with me on this, and he's highly intelligent and knows a lot about the occult, cracked the Zodiac identity cipher in July of 2010, and it named Edward Edwards. For those that don't know what the Zodiac identity cipher was, it was a 13-character cipher that the Zodiac Killer sent in 1970, actually on the anniversary of the Deer Lodge prison riot, April 20th, 1959 is when the riot was. And those 13 characters ended up being Edward's name in mirror image, and Edward Edwards, actually that is 13 characters, the name Edward Edwards. And once we cracked the identity cipher, we confronted Edwards by letter and phone call for a year, and he led us on a game of murder. And he was the Zodiac Killer, but he kept telling us that we didn't know the whole story, and boy, was he right.
Incredible. Just incredible stuff. And again, a 2-hour show isn't enough to talk about this. You got to get his book. Another set of murders that I want to throw out there before I forget to ask you this, because, limited amount of time, I have to squeeze this stuff in there. Adam Walsh. Now, this one is kind of close to home because I live in South Florida. Now, I know the Hollywood police, in police lingo, they like two guys for it, and they came out a couple years ago and said that it's most likely them and blah, 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 blah. I don't think it was the two guys they blamed. Now, in my research, I came across a connection to the dark occult again when it came to his murder, and perhaps it could have been a cult of individuals that did it, or it could have been done as part of some sort of ceremony. And then here comes your book, years later, and you're saying that a guy who has connections to a cult and was a Satanist killed this little boy and decapitated him. Now, whether he did it by himself or as part of a ceremony or whatever, it's just to me it's interesting connection. It doesn't quite glue everything together, but it kind of steers you more in the direction of what you're talking about. So the murder of Adam Walsh. How were you able to connect Edwards to him?
Well, for those of your listeners that don't know who Adam Walsh was, he was the son of John Walsh, America's Most Wanted host. Adam was kidnapped July 27th, 1981. Actually, he was kidnapped just after Edwards finished the Atlanta child killings, which were just over in Atlanta, Georgia, where he killed 24 little kids there. And so he went to Hollywood, Florida, and he kidnapped Adam Walsh. I had no idea that this case was going to come into this investigation. And what happened was in about the third year of the investigation, after I determined that Edwards had set up those websites regarding the Black Dahlia and all of that, I found that he had been blogging on the internet for over 15 years against his own cases. And in 2008, the Hollywood, Florida police went public and named Otis Toole as the killer of Adam Walsh. And the two people you were referring to were Henry Lucas and Otis Toole, and that's who the police always tried to peg for Adam Walsh. But Edwards went online on his birthday, June 14th, 2009, just after the police had taken his DNA, and he realized he was going to go down for his first murder in Wisconsin. And he actually confessed to being the killer of Adam Walsh and confessed to being the Zodiac Killer, and also told everybody that John Walsh had received Zodiac Killer letters back in 1991. And, in fact, John Walsh had received letters signed by Scorpion. And those letters actually were written by Edwards in 1991, taunting John Walsh, the host of America's Most Wanted, to catch him, because Edwards was America's Most Wanted. He taunted John Walsh from the time that he killed his son in 1981 all the way up until his death, because Edwards always claimed to be the best criminal ever, and that's what he wanted to go down in. And what he really meant was the best killer ever. And here John Walsh was doing a show on America's Most Wanted, and Edwards' confession can be read on my timeline if you go to June 14th, 2009, and you can read his confession to killing John Walsh's son, Adam, and it's pretty horrible. But it definitely tied him all together with the killing of Adam Walsh, 6 years old, JonBenét Ramsey, 6 years old, and little 6-year-old Suzanne Bigden, 6 years old, in Chicago in 46. He killed kids his whole life, and he killed them at the age that his life was destroyed, 6.
So it's very significant. Again, like you said, it goes to his childhood, that went back when his mother was it shot, and then he was put in a home, and they changed his name at a young age, you said, and that's, I guess it's weird to hear that had a profound effect on him. But I guess as a child, his probably being in such a traumatized state, maybe because of what he had been through up to the age of 5, whatever his background was with his parents, and then his mother being killed, and then losing his identity. I guess that is a way to start him on a path of, it's like two separate identities almost. And maybe he actually split in his mind, and there really was, two different identities, or it was just an act. But either way, you can see that this goes back to his childhood and the event of his mother's death. And then it's amazing how he metamorphosized, I can never get that word out, from the time he was 5 till 11, and turned in from this kid, 5-year-old kid, into a killer, and a pretty proficient one for an 11-year-old, I would say, at least in my opinion. The average 11-year-old doesn't think like that. The fact that if you're correct, and he was Dahlia's killer, he would have been like 13 and a half, 14 years old, you said, around that time. I mean, you'd have to be pretty proficient and in the mind, knowing how to cut a human body for a 13-year-old. I mean, there would be certain physical limitations to doing that, as some of these other killings and dismembering of the bodies, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah, he was precision, and he explains that all in detail, how he did it, actually, on blackdahliasolution.org. He actually explains the details of how he cut her up in the bathtub and hauled her out in her own suitcases, and stuck her in the back of the trunk in the suitcases, drove to the park, and laid her out right there. Now, he had completely dissected the 6-year-old girl just a year earlier, so dissecting the 22-year-old female was the representation of his mother, and dissecting the little 6-year-old girl that was destroying the little girl at the same age that he was destroyed. And when you look at the identity crisis he had, and you look at the Zodiac Killer teased us his entire life with his identity. And why did he do that? Because he didn't even know who he was. And that's because Edward was actually born Charles Edward Myers, named after his grandfather. And then his mother, Cecilia Myers, is shot suspiciously, lives 6 days, dies, and they change his name. Why did they change his name? Because grandfather didn't want the little bastard tied to the name. And I really believe that he shot his own mother at age 5. Accepted in the orphanage, changed his name, and it was an identity crisis, and he was raised in the era of the Cleveland torso murders.
John, I'm going to cut us off. I'm going to cut us off because the break's sneaking up, but I want to pick up right here on the other side. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be rattling through a bunch of questions here in the last 26 minutes with my guest, John Cameron. Go to his website, Cold Case Cameron, get his book. I'm going to have him plug everything really quick because not only does he have a website and a book, but he's also got a YouTube channel. And I want you to go to his YouTube channel because, again, it's at least like an addendum to the book itself. You can see what videos he's put up, and if there's video evidence, which I'm sure there is, he's got that up there as well. So I'm going to give John the floor and let him plug that, and then we're going to get back into the early childhood, because I know that was one of the questions, was does anybody think that Edwards was the one that killed his mother? And I had mentioned that earlier in the first hour. And then we're going to get into the police looking into this stuff, and we're going to get. I have a few questions that have been thrown at me that have to get asked. But first, go ahead, John, and plug your site, your book, and your YouTube channel, and anything else you want to throw out there really quick.
Well, yeah, I'd love people to buy my book. It's me, Edward Wayne Edwards, a serial killer never heard of. I never intended to actually write a book, but I realized that I was into an investigation that had to be released publicly because there really wasn't any law enforcement agency that investigated this man after his capture. And I wanted the people to know the information because there are about a dozen people sitting in prison right now that are innocent on his murders. But if you also go to my website, coldcasecameron.com, there's a timeline of this man's entire life. And you can watch the videos and see all the recognition he got throughout his life. He appeared on game shows, TV, radio, newspapers everywhere, bragging that he was reformed. And he was killing in these communities while he was bragging. So, yeah, I'd appreciate if people go to that site and let's get some of these innocent people released.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually an aspect that I don't think a lot of people realize, and you have it listed in the back of the book, is the actual amount of people that went to jail, and some have been actually executed for crimes that you've connected Edwards to. And we're going to get into, there's questions about, why he admitted to some of the stuff and why some of the information he told you, which we can get into. But I want to focus on that early childhood for a second, because that's important. That was one of the questions I know was asked earlier, and I'd mentioned this earlier. Do you think that Edwards killed his mother? And you did say when we were going into break that you do think that he might have been responsible for her murder as well, the shooting. And that means that if that's true, then he would have been 5 when he did his first murder, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the importance of that, the date of that killing, August 2nd, 1938. She lived until August 8th. Her funeral was August 10th. He had committed completely ritualistic killings on those dates, and if you look at the killings he actually confessed to in 2010, they occurred on the date of the death of his mother. And that's what he was. He was ritualistic. If you look at Adam Walsh, his head was placed August 10th, 1981 to be found, and that was the date of his mother's funeral. Edwards was ritualistic like that, and he would kill and place bodies. Christmas, April 1st, his mother's birthday, August, his mother's death, Easter, July 4th, Memorial Day, any type of holiday, Christian holiday. He was raised so horribly from the very beginning. Between 1933 and 38 in Cleveland, Ohio, where he was raised, a serial killer was loose called the Cleveland Torso Murder. And what that person was doing was cutting up individuals in pieces and laying them out in public. And this is Ed's first 5 formative years. This is all over the papers in Cleveland. There was well over a dozen people killed and cut up. And that's what he would mimic in his first murders, when he cut up the little girl in the basement and then cut up the Black Dahlia and laid her out in the public park. He laid out, he did what he was exposed to from birth until the time he escaped Carbondale Orphanage. He was just completely destroyed spiritually and physically, mentally.
And, that can be traumatic enough to fracture somebody's mind. The Nazis perfected what they called trauma-based mind control. And again, this goes into something that I've talked about. I'm not saying he was mind controlled, but they understand that a large trauma can cause someone's mind to fracture like that. So it makes you wonder if there was actually another personality that was created inside of his mind that was this killer. Not saying that he didn't know about it, but that's actually perhaps this second personality took over, because that happens as a defense mechanism, and perhaps, this inner evil, came out. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if he was ever psychologically examined. I would assume that they had a psychological examination done of him. If so, what was the outcome of that?
I recovered his 1956 psychological evaluation that was done in Deer Lodge Prison, and it showed that he was a sadomasochist, psychopath, deep hatred for women, and had been kidnapping women his whole life and getting away with it because he was so good at the talk. He'd get arrested repeatedly, but then be able to, not for murder, but for other crimes, burglary, robbery, forgery, and then talk his way out by supplying them information on a murder he committed and steer it to an innocent guy and give them the information that would lead to them, and he'd get out. And that started actually in Florida in 1951 when he was 17 years old, and he went AWOL from the Marines. For a year he was out killing and got caught, but they didn't know it. And they gave him a deal, and they released him. Even though he went AWOL from the Marines, they released him, and he ran again for 2 more years killing and got caught again for a robbery, but they didn't know he was killing, and he talked his way out again. And this was his history all his life. He would get arrested for robberies, burglaries, arsons, and talk his way out of prison.
He was a very smooth guy. That's why I say I think that, as he got older, his IQ had to have been higher, because not only was he, do you have this level of intelligent thinking, but at the same time you're able to pull off charm on top of it. Not everybody that's smart and intelligent can pull off being personable. Sometimes they come off as cold and robotic, or like condescending pricks almost. And in order to get away with a lot of the stuff that he did get away with and get out of things, he would have had to have been a smooth operator. And that's how, it almost was like getting with his prey too. Like he lured them in. They didn't realize he was a spider until it was too late.
Yeah, he had a certain punch. He called it the rabbit punch. And it was a punch to the throat that breaks the hyoid bone. And that meant that he had gotten that close to his victims, and they were unsuspecting of him. And that would be his signature punch. And a lot of the victims would have a broken hyoid bone. And what that means is that Edwards groomed his way right into their life, was probably sitting there talking to them like the nicest person in the world, and then all of a sudden, whack. He demonstrates it in that video on YouTube in June of 2010 on my website. And it basically leaves the victim alive, unable to breathe, but having to live through the horror he's about to do to you.
That's so sick and twisted. I mean, the fact that you know how to immobilize somebody, but not enough to kill them to where they won't feel what you're about to do to them. Just enough to, to immobilize. It's, ugh. I mean, how many people think of that during the course of the day, as opposed to, like you get up in the morning, you're like, I have to go to work, I have to pay my car payment today, maybe go to the post office, maybe go food shopping. Meanwhile, this guy's thinking of how he can incapacitate somebody, but yet not do so where it's completely fatal, at least long enough anyway, to the point where they're going to be alive for the next few minutes while he does other just horrific things to them. I mean, it's horrific to think about on so many levels. I'm researching serial killers over the course of time. Again, I understand monsters. I understand, the ghouls. I get them. But this guy's a different level. I think he's above them. As a detective, would you say that he's probably one of the smartest, if not the smartest killer that you've come across in your, research and in your time as a cold case detective?
When I first started this, I got the sense that this was not going to be normal. Just the whole way it was evolving. All you had to do is follow the evidence he laid. But yeah, he had an evil that was beyond anything I'd ever dealt with. And there was a period of time when my friend Neil and I were questioning him and writing letters back and forth, that we had opened up Pandora's box and we knew there was no closing it. And we had no idea who he had connections to. But he is the most evil person that I have ever dealt with in my whole life. And yet, I felt like I could have talked to him for days and months just because of the incredible intelligence level. As an investigator, that's what you look at.
Yeah, that's one of the alarm bells that went off with me, was just the level of intelligence this guy had. Not even so much the horror of what he did, but I mean, maybe I'm numb to it a little bit, but I'm able to look past that and see something deeper. And I mean, this guy I think is above many of these other prolific killers. And if we can connect him with evidence to these murders, that's even more important. And that's my next question is, I know that you've, researching this over the course of time, you've bumped into some police departments that don't want to, even though you're a fellow officer, they don't want to deal with it. And I've seen that before, that they don't want to reinvestigate their cases and stuff for numerous reasons. Maybe some of them could be involved, at a deeper level, like we're talking about the cults before. Who knows? But the point is, you've been, and you've had people that are also willing to help too. But I'm sure you've run into some flack with many of these police agencies, and I know you have with some of them. But since you did the coast to coast interview, now it's like a two-part question. Since you did the coast to coast interview, I know you've been reached out or reached, like emailed by other police departments, and you have gone around and spoken to some. So first, why do you think that they haven't looked into these crimes? And since you did the coast to coast interview and you got the book out there and people have heard it, do you think that some of those people that were against it might end up changing their minds and realizing that there is more evidence to back up what you're talking about? Or do you think that they're still going to be, stalwart in their beliefs and stick to their guns?
Well, I think they'll probably stick to their guns and nobody will investigate a lot of these things. But that's why I wrote the book, because then it'll be out there in the public and it'll be out there forever, and people can make their own decisions as to whether or not this man was capable of doing all this. But Edwards was a very hard person, to wrap. People couldn't wrap their minds around a guy like this. I could, because I ended up kind of befriending him and had a lot of, contact with him by letter, which was very important because he was a writer. And I knew that at the beginning that I needed his writing. Edwards always planted DNA at his cases. So a lot of the murders that are sitting out there unsolved have DNA just sitting out there, and police departments don't investigate. They just check the DNA. And in this case, in Great Falls in 1956, they supposedly recovered some DNA in 2002, and it didn't match Edwards. But it's because he planted evidence at every one of his scenes and actually admitted all this. Would leave hair clutched in the hands of some of his victims, would leave blood, semen, saliva, fiber patterns, blood patterns. That way it would never direct to him. It makes investigations very difficult. You have to do the work to catch a guy like Ed Edwards. And he had put it all out there to be caught, but you had to really follow his life and do the work.
Again, you can't listen to a 2-hour radio show and go, oh well, I think the guy did it, or no, I think John Cameron is full of it. You have to do the research, and again, I mean, even if you're only able to forensically or whatever, through the system, connect him to half of the murders that you say that he's connected to. Wow, I mean, how many open cases could you close? How much closure could you finally bring to many of these cases? And it's chilling to even think about it. I think it's so deep that either people think there's no way that it could be reality, or perhaps maybe they don't want to admit to a mistake. But I think, honestly, I think one of the because I've seen this myself. I think one of the first biggest speed bumps in the research of this is people saying, "Well, come on, there's all these different murders. It's all the blah 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 blah." But if you understand again that his MO, see, I didn't understand that either until I thought about it, and I was like, well, his MO, and you said this, his MO wasn't so much the killing itself. It was the killing was part of the much bigger MO. Like his was much different. That's why I say that if you are correct, John, this guy is different than any other. He's like the next evolution of serial killer. It's kind of scary, the way that he was operating mentally, and I hope that the police agencies take you seriously. Now we got about 10 minutes left. I have, as you know, a couple other questions about the evidence and stuff. But since the interview, have you been contacted by any police agencies out there to give you more information to back up what you've been talking about and maybe give you some more positive links with Edwards to some of these murders or other murders that you maybe even didn't know about?
Yeah, it actually has been radio that has been the word out. That's the only media that has covered this story. The major media has not covered it, and it's exactly because when I would call them, during the investigation, I would call media agencies for information. I would call police and tell them I have this, and the first reaction was, "You're nuts," and shut you off. That's always been the reaction to this, and I know it's still the reaction to some people. But when they heard me on the radio, then it's different, because it hits home to a lot of places. He did kill in every state, and there will be killings everywhere. And on the Coast to Coast interview, and also on the Hagman and Hagman interview, I ended up getting phone calls from policemen out east, Pennsylvania, Florida, North Carolina, tying murders to Edwards just because of the information I was giving. And it really opened up a period of time that I didn't know what he was doing, and that was 1996 to 1999. And those years were so important, but I didn't have a lot of information on my timeline as to what he was doing after he killed JonBenét in 96. But those interviews opened up what he was doing, and he was killing in Pennsylvania just repeatedly. And he was blogging on Google Blog, and I didn't know this. And he actually set up an entire site of all his murders, blogging against people trying to challenge him. And many of the bloggers thought that the guy they were confronting on this site was the real killer, and they were right. It was. And that coast-to-coast interview and Hagman interview opened that up, and it's opened up a whole other book, actually, that's going to have to be put out about what's come about since the release of the book.
That's awesome, like an addendum to it. And I mean, I encourage you, put it together, please. When you do, I'll bring you on again, and we'll chat about it, because this is a subject. Again, 2 hours doesn't do it justice. And in fact, I'm interested. We'll chat about this off air, but I mean, I would love to pick your brain about other serial killers too. Obviously, you're a seasoned investigator, a cold case detective, and you know what you're talking about. I would love to have you back on to pick your brain about other investigations as well. We could still plug the book too, but since we got about 7 minutes left, I have a couple other questions that I've been asked to ask you by people submitting them to me, and one of them is this. There's a couple of them, but this one's the number one asked question. So, and that would be, and it's a two-parter. First, what kind of evidence, for someone that's on the fence? Okay, really, I don't think that he's connected to all this stuff. What kind of evidence could you say that? I know there's more on the site, but what could you throw out there right off the bat to try to convince them that he is connected to some of these murders? Perhaps conversations with him, things he might have admitted. And the second part of that question is, and I'm sure you get this a lot, if he did admit to this stuff to you, then do you think that if your analysis of him is correct, where he wanted attention, do you think he's just admitting to connections to some of these murders just for that, so he gets recognition because he knows he's getting older, and perhaps he knows he's getting close to his mortal end here in this world? So do you think maybe he could have just been lying and trying to connect dots that weren't there?
Edward lied his whole life, so everything he said was a lie, and he told me that repeatedly. But this is different regarding what he wanted. He was a writer, a publisher, and he wanted some recognition, and what he wanted was to put it all out there as a puzzle. Because he always felt he was smarter than every cop, every prosecutor, anybody that came around. But he also knew that in the end, when it was discovered who he really was, and he actually didn't think it was going to happen until 2058, is what he actually had blogged at one point. He didn't think anybody would put it together. But being in Deer Lodge Prison, I just happened to be in the right position where he had been in 1956. That opened up the records that tied him to all the cases. No, he didn't lie about any of them, and I can say that pretty confidently because I wouldn't have followed this goose chase if it wasn't true, and he laid it all out there to be true. All you had to do was the work. I just had a group of people that were in the right position with a lot of help, and we have it all. And he's definitely the Zodiac Killer, and there's no doubt about that, and he basically was portraying himself as Satan. He wanted to go down in history as an ancient Egyptian god, like that people will be talking about this guy Ed Edwards 1,000 years from now, and what did he do? That was the purpose of it. And that's why he didn't stand up and proclaim I'm the Zodiac. He had actually been doing it his whole life in written publications, and nobody would listen.
Do you think that over the course of time, maybe perhaps investigators taking a lead from your book? Because that's why I'm glad you wrote the book, because it's almost like you've taken all this evidence that you had, and instead of trying to talk to somebody about it, and it kind of sounds scatterbrained to them, you can give them this book and say, read this. Here's the website as an addendum to it. Do the research yourself. Do you foresee, as an investigator, as a seasoned cold case detective, do you foresee your fellow compatriots in the law enforcement community taking this seriously and perhaps solving some of these murders and being able to finally, with maybe DNA evidence or some sort of concrete evidence, being able to nail him on the books for a lot of these murders?
Yeah, I do. It's going to take a long time to unravel, though. It took 66 years to create, if you think about it. Every waking moment of his life was thought about killing somebody, setting someone up, and also taunting the police with false letters and everything else. So, yeah, I knew it would be a long time. I didn't think it was going to be this long, but now that I've been in it this long, I realize that it'll be 3 or 4 more years, I think, before the actual, what he actually did comes out. But, yeah, they'll be forced to. There's a lot of people sitting in prison right now, and the police have the evidence. They have the letters. The newspapers have the letters that Edward sent. There's a lot of letters that Edward sent that were never divulged, and those letters were the answer. It was always about the writing.
The last question we have time for, because we have about 3 minutes left, is all the evidence that you have compiled, to connect him to these killings, is it, again, from a seasoned cold case detective standpoint, looking, how you could build a case through the legal system, get prosecutors to take it seriously, is it all just circumstantial, or is there more to it? Is there enough evidence, perhaps being able to link him? I'm sure they have a DNA sample still of him somewhere on file. Is there evidence maybe to compare to an old sample of his to see if they could connect him to any of these other murders?
Yeah, he's actually in the DNA CODIS data bank. But because he planted evidence, you can't just check the DNA. But what you can do is you can take your old evidence in your cases and send it in and see if he left evidence. Because in the old days, he was leaving skin cells and stuff like that, and we can now do skin cell DNA. But you really do have to do the investigation on Edwards. You just can't run his DNA. You have to look into what transpired in the case, because they all stand out. They always had a satanic connection. There were usually anonymous phone calls and letters in all of them. And it's actually the wounds on the victims' bodies and things actually tied to ritualism and satanic occult also. So there's a lot of things you have to look at. And my book basically is just 400-some pages of a summary of the investigation, but I have hundreds, if not 1 million pages of the documentation on this guy and what he put out over the years. And that's kind of what I'm got the website for, and I'm slowly getting all my documents in there, but I've got thousands and thousands of pages that I'll be putting on there for people to read, PDF files of Edwards testifying in trials and things like that.
I'm really interested to see what comes of this, and in the long term, 4 or 5 years from now, if you'll see on the news out of nowhere one day, John Cameron, cold case detective John Cameron solves, old murder, Black Dahlia murder solved, whatever, JonBenét Ramsey murder solved, whatever. It would be interesting to see if in 4 or 5 years it actually comes out, or if he is connected to some of these deeper, darker cults, then maybe it won't. Who knows? But hopefully there will be some good law enforcement officers out there that'll pick up the ball and run with it. John, we are out of time. thank you so much for coming on, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it too.
It's been an honor, and like I said, I'll chat with you off air about coming back on, so stay right there. Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. Check it out. I urge you to always do the research yourself.
This is Sparta!
ColdCaseCameron.com, ColdCaseCameron.com. The book is titled It's Me, Edward Wayne Edwards, the serial killer you never heard of. We are out of time. As I always tell you, the solutions to our problems are an inside job. Do your research. I love you all. I'll catch you all again live next week. I am out of here.